Hi, this is Professor Raymond here to talk to you a little bit about information and evaluating it. To do that, I'm going to talk about primary scientific literature and try to help you distinguish it from secondary, tertiary, and much worse types of literature. Suppose I'm interested in a particular topic. Autism is something that I'm very interested in. If I go to Google and try again, and I put in autism, I'll come up with lots and lots of facts from lots of different things. There's almost 5 million results that I just got here. How do I separate out the really good information from the bad information? Here's one of the things that I might pick up from a search like that. This is from Age of Autism, daily web newspaper of the autism epidemic. And right here, there's a film that I could watch that would tell me all about how autism was caused by mercury, and there's a section in it that even tells me that the first child ever with autism was in 1931, shortly after thimerosal was introduced to diphtheria vaccines. Now, I know this is bullshit because I know that there's been autism around since the beginning of time. I know that my family had autism in it for many generations. But looking at this, it looks fairly legitimate. If I listen to their little tape, they show scientists, they show what appear to be reputable scientific papers. How do I know whether or not this is good information? Well, first of all, the fact that they are telling me about scientific papers tells me that this information is somewhat removed from the scientific papers themselves. When scientists research something and actually publish about it, they don't publish it in the Age of Autism, the daily web newspaper of the autism epidemic. Where they publish their results in is peer-reviewed scientific journals. Now, if somebody reads a peer-reviewed scientific journal and reports on what they read and tells me about it, it's quite possible that they're telling me something that was truly in those papers, but it's also possible they're lying to me, or they might be lying to themselves. They might have just not understood. Maybe no lying involved at all, but sometimes these scientific papers are difficult to understand. I'm depending on somebody else to interpret it for me. Maybe I'll look at something different. Now, here is another web source. This one is an organization run by Jenny McCarthy, Generation Rescue. Notice one of the very first things you see on here is a button to donate before you get to any of the actual information. That kind of looks like a red flag to me, but this is not the place that you would find primary scientific literature. I'm not trying to say that Jenny McCarthy is wrong, but what I am trying to say is that if you're trying to interpret information, it's important to separate out information that comes directly from a scientific study and information that's been interpreted for you. Or in many cases, information that's been interpreted for you through multiple iterations. Sometimes I'll read something and the person who wrote it didn't read the paper. They just read something that somebody else wrote about the paper. So if I read the paper itself, I'm reading primary literature. If I'm reading from somebody who read the paper, then that's called secondary literature. If I read something from someone who read about it from somebody else who wrote the paper, that might be tertiary. The further I get from the original source, the less certainty I can have that it was really understood completely all the way through. How many times have you read an article in a newspaper that said, for example, new studies show that caffeine is good for your health. And a week later, read something that said, new study shows that caffeine is bad for your health. These things seem to be contradictory, and it might seem to you that science isn't really reliable at all if it keeps giving you these different interpretations. In fact, what's going on is the person who wrote the article didn't really understand what the original article was saying. They just sort of tried to simplify it down. And in simplifying it down, they might have lost a lot of the important nuances. If you go back to the original study, the study probably never said that caffeine was good for your health or caffeine was bad for your health. It probably explained some very limited effect that they were able to prove that caffeine had. And both of them may well be true. The actual studies were not contradictory. What was contradictory was the interpretations made for you by somebody else who read it for you. As a science student, I want you to learn to go to the original papers, learn it for yourself. Don't depend on someone else to interpret it for you. Here, I've got something else that you might find about autism. Here we've got somebody who is basically saying that they think autism is a total scam. It doesn't exist at all. And you can find a bunch of people spouting off on it. Is this good scientific information here? Maybe some of them read some scientific papers, but who knows? Here we've got an organization that is respected by many, Autism Speaks, and it's got an article about one of my favorite topics, which is the hormone oxytocin and how it affects autism. Now, in this, they talk specifically about some studies that tested intranasal oxytocin sprays and some results of that. Very interesting stuff, but it's not original research. It's them talking about someone else who did original research. If I want to find out the real thing, I need to skip these intermediaries, whether they are intermediaries that are respected or not respected. I want to skip them. Here we've got another one. This is specifically talking about researchers that study oxytocin nasal sprays. Again, this one is from Autism Speaks. Rather than have Autism Speaks tell me about the study, why not look at the actual study itself? If I click to try to find the actual study, let's see what happens. It turns out this isn't really showing me the original study either. This is just telling me their interpretation of the study that someone there read. It's not original research at all. Just doing Google searches is probably not the best way of doing it. You might find some interesting stuff. Here's something from the New York Times. Oxytocin found to stimulate social brain regions in children with autism. New York Times is certainly much more respected than the previous things that I've shown you, but this still isn't actually doing the original study. I wonder if this link will take me to the real original study. Good news. Up here it says Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is a journal that is peer-reviewed. It actually makes sure that all of the things that are published in it have gone through the peer review process. What peer review means is that other experts, scientists who study autism, have read the paper and helped to correct any mistakes that might have been in it. Or if it just turned out that whoever wrote it was writing bullshit, then they would reject it and they wouldn't publish it. Now, in order to get the entire thing, I can go over here and hopefully I will get the actual article. I have to trust this. And now I've got the actual article, Oxytocin Enhances Brain Function in Children with Autism. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Can I see the date here? This was just December of 2013, so not too long ago, a little less than a year ago. A little hard to read it in this form, so what I'm going to do is save it. And I will save it in my, let's see, I want to give it the title. Damn, can't remember the title. Go back, here's the title. So I'm going to call it Oxytocin Enhances Brain Function in Children with Autism. And I am going to save that in my Dropbox folder, and I'll put it under Autism Research. And it turns out I've already saved that before. So I'm going to just leave that. Now this is a much easier source to get information from. Well, not easier. It's much more reliable. I can be sure that things that are in this have been reviewed by scientists, as opposed to something like this. This is a report from NPR, National Public Radio, and this is talking about a new study that showed that oxytocin actually is not lacking in people with autism. Now, some people looked at the reports about the original study on this and said, oh, this means that oxytocin doesn't affect autism at all. In fact, some original papers said that oxytocin helps people with autism. This one was looking at whether or not it's a cause, and they found oxytocin levels in people with autism essentially normal. That doesn't mean that oxytocin doesn't help, and it doesn't mean that oxytocin doesn't cause. It's more complicated than that. Popular sources tend to oversimplify, and because of that, they often lose some of the detail. Even things like Psychology Today, which is a somewhat scientific magazine, this one doesn't publish peer-reviewed journal articles. Peer-reviewed journal articles would be more difficult for the average person to understand, but they would be more likely to be absolutely reliable. This is an attempt to interpret it for you. It's a better attempt than perhaps this original one that we had from the Age of Autism. It's certainly better, but it's still not what we're looking for. If I use the search sources from our library at school, I can actually get online access to lots of journal articles, some of them primary, some of them review articles. Here's one that I got by doing that. This one is a brief report This isn't really a full scientific article, but it is peer-reviewed. So it's more useful, but it's not what we think of as the best possible source, a primary source. Here's another one. This one is from Neurotherapeutics. This is a peer-reviewed journal, so I can rely on information from it. This one, notice here where it says review article. A review article means it's secondary. It's going to be a good article, and it's going to give me a lot of important information, but it's not really going to be the information directly from the people who did the research in the first place. So it's not going to be the best possible. If I look at this one, here we've got an article on intranasal oxytocin, and it's a randomized controlled trial. This is actually, again, from a peer-reviewed journal, Molecular Autism, and in this, it's going to give me the report on the actual study. It's written by the professors, researchers who actually did the study, and it's their original research of it. This is the best possible source of information because it comes directly from the people who did the study. There's no chance of misinterpretation. It's been reviewed by peers to make sure that they didn't make mistakes. This is the kind of information that I can really rely on. Now, this doesn't mean that it's absolutely going to be true. There might be problems with the design of the experiment. There might be interpretations that aren't entirely warranted by the data, but at least this is going to be the best I can get, having gone directly to the source, primary, and having other scientists review it. I can be a lot more sure of this than most other things. Here's another one. This is another randomized trial. Mitigation of socio-communicational deficits of autism through oxytocin-induced recovery of medial prefrontal activity. When you find primary research, it sometimes has very long titles that can be difficult to understand. It's the difficulty in understanding primary literature that leads so many people to go to other forms, secondary, tertiary literature. But if you really want to be sure of what you're doing, your best bet is to slog through and try to understand the primary literature. Here's another one. This is another review paper, Social Motivation and Oxytocin in Autism. Again, this is about one of my favorite subjects, oxytocin and autism. In this case, they're actually looking at a number of different studies that have looked at autism and oxytocin. And what they're doing is summarizing the information from all of those different studies. Now, this is a good place for me to start. By reading this, I can find out a lot of information about different topics, or different studies that were done on oxytocin and autism. But if I actually want to find out what the original study was saying, then I should go to the literature reviewed here at the end and actually find each of these studies and look up each of these. By looking up the studies, I can then go to the primary source and find out. Quick review. When scientists do original research, they publish something called primary literature. Primary literature is the best source of information, but it can be difficult to understand. Secondary literature involves review articles, other people interpreting it for you. This might make it easier to understand, but because it separates it from the original source, it may not be quite as accurate. When things move to tertiary or quaternary literature, when things move out of the peer-reviewed journals and into things that people can just publish without having to convince any editor or publisher or colleagues that what they're doing is correct, then there's even more chances for error. There's a big difference between reading something in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry and reading something that I find on the Age of Autism daily web newspaper of the autism epidemic. Some things are more reliable than others, and as a science student, you need to learn what's the best way to get your